Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first attempt at a digital Sunday school class. Each week we're going to try to offer a Sunday school course led by one person or another. We're still sort of determining what that program will look like and who will do what. But I have the privilege of kicking it off this morning, and I hope you'll tune in future weeks as well to the various Sunday school lessons that we're going to offer. It's been quite a week, hasn't it? IPC has gone from limiting our gatherings to completely shutting down, and all of us are working to move our operations online. And it's been an amazing week to see how everyone has pitched in and done their part. Community Ministries has mobilized to continue to keep the food pantry open. Congregational Care is looking after our older and most vulnerable folks and trying to coordinate ways to provide for their needs. Finance and Buildings and Grounds have worked hard to be flexible with the schedule that lies before us during the shutdown, and everyone has just sort of pitched in their own way. And I feel so fortunate to be a part of a staff that has come together and mobilized as well as we have at IPC. So be sure to thank anyone on staff that you communicate with. Know that everyone is working hard and doing our best to continue to stay connected and to minister to each of you during these days apart. So our Sunday school lesson today is titled Mysterious and Trustworthy, two of God's inseparable attributes. I want to give you a little background about why I chose this lesson before we begin. As many of you know, I recently transitioned from pastoral care to Christian education. And as I've thought about my new role in CE, I've wondered to myself, what should be the goal or the object of Christian education in general, and particularly at IPC? What should we be trying to accomplish through our offerings in CE? What should we be trying to create and foster and cultivate in our members? To answer that question, I was thinking about many of my experiences in congregational ministries, and I was wondering, what would I want to know about God when I came to the end of my life? In other words, what would be the most important thing for me to hold on to in the waning moments of my life? What would I want to be sure that I knew about God? I've even been able to ask this question to a few folks in the last month who have been more in that season of life, not necessarily right at the end of their life, but I've been sort of putting my feelers out there and saying, what are the most important things at this stage in your life? What are the most important components of your faith that you would want other people to also have when they reach this moment in life? And the answer that I've sort of come up with so far is pretty simple. That is a deep trust in God. A deep trust in God. And so I've been thinking, you know what I think we should aim to accomplish through all of our CE offerings is for people to grow in their depth of trust in God. It's a very simple sort of goal, but it at least can be a guiding light to the rationale that we offer for why it is that we do what we do in Christian ed. So today's lesson began by reflecting on what does it mean to trust in God. And I think trusting in God is not always easy because we have to trust in God not only because of what we know about God, not only because of our certainty, but also, and perhaps more importantly, we have to trust God even while God maintains a large degree of unknowability or mystery. The theological term for unknowability is inscrutability. To say that God is inscrutable is simply to say that God is mysterious, that we cannot investigate our way to knowing God completely. We can only know God and God's actions to the extent to which God chooses to reveal the divine self to us. In other words, God's knowability is entirely up to God. This is called revelation, or a doctrine of revelation. For God to reveal God's self to us, God is the one that has that prerogative. We cannot prompt that. by soliciting it from God, God has to offer revelation or self-knowledge of God to us. So the experience of faith, which is exhibited throughout the Bible and in the lives of Christians throughout the ages, the experience of faith is that we have to hold together our trust in God with also our understanding that God is mysterious. We might say God is trustworthy yet mysterious, or equally true, God is mysterious and yet trustworthy. But at any rate, mysteriousness, trustworthiness, they have to be held together in our faith experience when we think about who God is. Because after all, there are always things that happen in our lives, right, that we struggle to understand. And so from a faith perspective, that means that there are things that happen to us in life that make us struggle to understand God, right? I think it's common for almost all of us that at some point along our faith journeys, we're going to ask some form of the question, why do bad things happen, particularly to good people or people who do not deserve them? Why do bad things happen disproportionately to people who are especially good or especially undeserving of those kind of bad things? Sometimes this question is couched as an intellectual question, right? It's a question in philosophy, the question of theodicy. How can it be that bad things happen and yet God is altogether good? It's a sort of intellectual quagmire in which we get stuck. But I think that there's usually a pastoral concern beneath the sort of philosophical wrappings or the cognitive wrappings of this question. Sometimes I'll talk to people who are struggling with their faith in God, or perhaps have lost their faith in God because they say they just can't understand why bad things happen. And at first they tend to present it as an intellectual struggle, right? How could so many people die in Asia in the 2005 tsunami, for example? But with a little digging, oftentimes we discover that the question actually hits more close to home, and that what's really challenging for a person is something more like, how could God allow my mother to suffer so much before she finally died? Why couldn't she just die peacefully and suddenly without having to endure all that pain? Something like that, something that's really enduring and hits us at a deep point and is related to someone or something that we care deeply about. I remember my own life when I first began to wrestle with this question intellectually. I was in college, sitting in a nice air-conditioned classroom of a private liberal arts school, wondering how all those people out there could suffer so much and struggle so much and yet believe in God. It was sort of an intellectual question. You know, there's so much pain in the world, and I was sort of learning about that at that time in my life and realizing just how widespread issues of poverty and disease were, and yet also learning about how Christianity is thriving in many of these areas that are most hard hit by the very things that made me wonder how people there could believe in God. And so I sort of wondered about it, and then I had an experience when I was in Guatemala. I think it was in 2008. We visited the Guatemala City dump, where there's actually a small colony of people who scrape out a living there, sorting through garbage. They have a sort of colony in there where they've built structures in which they find shelter and so on. So we were there, and we visited a woman. I remember she had a giant Pepsi banner as one of her walls. And she was talking to us about how much God has done for her, how much God provides for her every day. And it sort of dawned on me at that point, as I was right before this very faithful person with a deep level of trust in God, that I think so much of our default view of the world, determines the extent to which we think or we ask whether bad things that happen come from God or not. You know, in the West, we perhaps have a default view of the world as basically good. Many of us live our lives knowing where we'll get our next meal, having shelter, having discretionary income that we can use for various pleasures. So the world is sort of by default good. And then when something bad happens, it's sort of out of the ordinary for us. And so it stands out and we wonder, how could God allow this bad thing to happen? But perhaps in other parts of the world where people struggle a little bit more with getting their basic needs met, the default state of the world is mostly hard or challenging or stressful. And so then whenever something good happens, they see it as a gift from God. And so while we see bad things that happen as reason to question whether we can trust God, they see every good thing that happens as all the more reason to trust God. I don't know if there's something to that or not, but for myself, that's been a helpful experience in thinking about the problem of evil generally. And that is that our default view of the world, if we see the world by default as good or bad, that will influence the extent to which we believe we can trust God when particular things happen in the midst of our lives. So the way that we approach faith then is crucial in determining whether or not our faith will endure the trials of our lives in such a way that when we come to the end, our trust in God will be firm and secure. Now, of course, the extent to which we trust God is not salvific, because God saves us whether we have firm or brittle faith, because God is gracious, and thank goodness for that, right? God saves us because God is gracious. But the deeper our trust in God, the more spiritual resources we'll have to draw on throughout our lives whenever we encounter hard times. And that's why it's worth building our sense of trust in God. It's not so that we can be more certain of our salvation. Of course, we can always be certain in that because of what Christ has done for us. But it's so that we have more spiritual resources to draw on throughout the course of our lives. I like to think of faith kind of like a balloon that constantly needs to expand in order to incorporate all the new experiences that we encounter throughout the course of our lives, whether good or bad. Sometimes the balloon expands quickly to accommodate a drastic new experience we've never encountered before, and this stretching can be incredibly painful. These are those challenging moments in the lives of our faith where when we're experiencing something that we never thought would happen, all of a sudden it's happening to us. That's a huge expanding of our capacity to understand the world around us, and it can be incredibly painful, but ultimately it's necessary if we're going to live in the world honestly, even while we are yet trusting that God's faithfulness indeed endures forever and is new every morning. So I believe that the key to maintaining the necessary elasticity to our faith, if you will, to continue the balloon metaphor, the key to maintaining elasticity in our faith is to learn to live in the tension of God's mysteriousness while maintaining our trust in God even still. We have to learn to live in that tension of God's mysteriousness. There's some questions that we will encounter in this life to which we will simply not find satisfactory answers. But what we do know about God through Jesus Christ is enough to help us maintain our trust in God even when we do not know all of the things that God knows. So I'd like to have a look at the book of Psalms today in the Bible, which will help us to observe the ways in which the psalmists proclaim these two attributes of God together so often throughout the Psalms, that God is both that God is both trustworthy and mysterious or inscrutable. The psalmists hold these two attributes together so clearly. And so we're going to open the book of Psalms for the next part of our lesson. So I would encourage you now to grab your Bible, open to the middle, and let's take a look at some Psalms. Okay, so hopefully you've got your Bibles now. I've got mine here. This is the NIV. All my NRSVs are at church, but we will make do with the NIV. We just talked about how there's an inseparable link throughout the Bible between God's trustworthiness and God's inscrutability or mysteriousness. And it's exhibited all throughout the Old Testament, but especially in the book of Psalms, to which we now turn. The Psalms exhibit vividly and poignantly how God is both mysterious and hard to understand sometimes, and yet trustworthy. Someone upon whom we can always ultimately rely, even when we do not understand. Now, as you may know, the Psalms are liturgical songs that have become the prayers of the people of faith throughout the centuries. They can be sorted into all sorts of types, like Psalms of praise or Psalms of thanksgiving, but today I'd like to have a look at the Psalms of lament and the way in which these particular psalms hold together these twin attributes that we're looking at today, the attributes of mystery and trustworthiness. There's two kinds of lament psalms. There are laments of the individual and the laments of a community. In other words, some are singular and some are collective. There are more psalms of the individual, lament psalms of the individual, and so we'll have a look at those first. Take a look at Psalm 3. Very early on in the Psalter, we get our first psalm of lament. And this psalm is more an affirmation of trust than it is a lament. Have a look at that psalm. It says, "O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying to me, there is no help for you in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, and the one who lifts up my head. I cry aloud to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy hill. I lie down and sleep, and I wake again, for the Lord sustains me. I am not afraid of 10,000 of people who have set themselves all around me. Rise up, O Lord, deliver me, O my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. Deliverance belongs to the Lord. May your blessing be on your people." So this psalm is mostly a psalm affirming trust in God even in the midst of enemies that are encircling and encamping against the psalmist. The sort of prototypical psalm of lament is Psalm 13. So if you'll just flip ahead 10 psalms, you'll get to Psalm 13. This is a short psalm of lament, but it exhibits very nicely and clearly the main components that typically comprise a psalm of lament. Of course, every psalm is unique in its own way, but certain components of this psalm are typical of lament psalms, and I'll point those out as we read through Psalm 13. So lament psalms often begin with an address to God, as Psalm 13 does. How long, O Lord? So the psalmist is talking directly to God. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? After an address, many lament psalms will move into the complaint itself, or the thing about which the psalmist is lamenting. Verse 2, "How long must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day long? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me?" So the complaint is pain in the psalmist's soul, sorrow in his heart, and this appears to be due to the prevalence of the enemy who is exalted over him. The enemy has gained control over this psalmist, which is causing him great distress. Then the psalm moves into a petition where something in particular is asked of God. The petition here is, "Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death. And my enemy will say, I have prevailed. My foes will rejoice, because I am shaken." So the petition is, answer my prayer here, God. And the psalmist, like many psalmists, actually put particular words in the mouth of the enemy. This is a striking thing about the psalmists. They don't refer just vaguely to what the enemy is saying. They actually offer direct quotations. The enemy, if God doesn't act, then the enemy will say, I have prevailed. And the psalmist sort of dreads particular affirmations from the enemies because there's a truth behind those affirmations that the psalmist is clearly very anxious about. And so the prayer is that God would act in order to prevent the enemies from being able to gloat or exalt over the psalmist. After the petition, the Psalms move into some more positive notes, usually an affirmation of trust. And that's what we see here in Psalm 13, verse 5. The psalmist shifts tone and says, "But I trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation." And the psalm ends with a note of praise. "I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me." That's the general structure of most lament psalms. They move from an address to a complaint, to a petition, to an affirmation of trust, and finally, more often than not, to a song of praise. And notice here in Psalm 13 how the psalmist acknowledges both God's inscrutability, or God's mysteriousness, and also God's trustworthiness. The questioning of God indicates the psalmist does not understand how it is that God would allow this enemy to be exalted over him, how God would allow the pain in the psalmist's soul to persist during all this time. The psalmist does not understand that about God. How could God allow this to continue? And yet, even while the psalmist wrestles with this mysteriousness of God, the psalmist also affirms his trust in God with a very strong statement. "My heart shall rejoice in your salvation." Even in the midst of this horrible trial, the psalmist affirms, "I trust in your steadfast love. My heart will rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord who has dealt bountifully with me." It doesn't seem like the psalmist is being dealt bountifully with right now, with an enemy exalted over him. And yet even still, despite the hardships of his present circumstances, he sees the larger picture of God's actions in his life such that his trust in God remains the same. Many psalms of lament get very fixated on this problem of the enemy. And, these enemies were, in the time of the psalmist, usually physical enemies. The people of Israel lived in the midst of changing empires surrounding them all the time, so enemies were often present. But in the history of the church's reading of these psalms, enemies can be spiritual enemies, internal enemies, things that we wrestle, struggle with, sin itself. There's all sorts of ways to read yourself and your own experiences into these stories into these psalms with enemies in them, even if you don't resonate with the experience of having actual human enemies, although some of us do, and certainly Christians around the world certainly still have these enemies in close proximity, threatening them in a very physical way every day. Many Psalms of Lament contain these sort of elaborate descriptions of the enemies. Psalm 22 is like this. This is the lament of the individual, and this is the psalm Jesus quotes on the cross. But if you look to verse 12, this is how the psalmist describes the enemies. In Psalm 22, verse 12, "Many bulls encircle me. Strong bulls of Bashan surround me." Bashan was well known for their cows and bulls. "They open wide their mouths at me like a ravening and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it's melted within my breast. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. For dogs are all around me. A company of evildoers encircles me. My hands and feet have shriveled. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots." Look at the contrast here that the psalmist draws between himself and the enemies. The enemies are these wild beasts, dogs and bulls and lions. And in contrast to that, the psalmist describes himself so pitifully. He's like a melted wax, poured out water, a dry mouth, shriveled up limbs. I mean, the contrast there is so stark. And it's amazing how vividly the psalmist describes his enemies, as though God doesn't know, right? There's a real wrestling here a real deep expression of the pain and reality of the present circumstances that the psalmists are not willing to ignore when they issue these complaints. But as we've said before, almost always these psalms eventually contain a sharp turn, a very sudden turn in which they affirm their assurance that God is faithful and trustworthy. They feel assured that God has heard them. And so there's these affirmations at the end of the Psalms of Lament that God hears us, God has delivered us in the past, God will deliver us now. In short, even despite all the complaints that have come before, at the end of it all, God is trustworthy. God is trustworthy. And this is consistent throughout the individual Psalms of Lament, but I also mentioned that there are communal Psalms of Lament. I want to touch on one of those as well before we move on. The communal Psalms would have been sung by congregations in times of national catastrophe or defeat or danger. So perhaps these Psalms are useful for us today as we face this pandemic. Psalm 74 is a really interesting communal lament because in this psalm, the affirmation of trust comes in the middle of the psalm and the petition comes at the end. So let's take a look at Psalm 74 as one more example of a psalm of lament, this one a communal lament. The psalm begins with a direct, pointed question to God. "O God, why do you cast us off forever? Why does your anger smoke against the sheep of your pasture?" This is a very strong beginning, isn't it? It's accusing God of not only casting the people of Israel away, but actually burning with anger against them. That's sort of an accusation, just to get into the complaints offered in this psalm. Then the affirmation of trust comes in the middle here in this psalm, and the people confess that despite their circumstances, God can be trusted, and they draw upon their past experiences to make this affirmation. Look at verse 12. The psalmist says, Yet God, my King, is from old, working salvation in the earth. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the dragons in the water. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. The ancient people believed in sea monsters, and there were lots of myths about sea monsters, and so Israel often affirms that God is greater than the sea monsters, who are not themselves gods. They are merely creatures that God has made. So there's a sort of demythologizing that the psalmists often do of common myths back in the day. Anyway, you divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the dragons. You cut openings for streams and torrents. You dried up ever-flowing streams. Yours is the day, yours also the night. You established the luminaries and the sun. You have fixed all the bounds of the earth. You made summer and winter. So the psalmist goes back to creation, to the very beginning, and affirms that because everything that exists belongs to God, and God has made it, God can be trusted even when that creation seems to be running out of control, running wild. Nevertheless, God is the one who created the earth, and the earth continues to belong to God. And so in this psalm, it's after that, in verse 20, that the psalmist offers the petition at the end of the psalm. He says, "Have regard for your covenant, for the dark places of the land are full of the haunts of violence. Do not let the downtrodden be put to shame. Let the poor and needy praise your name. Rise up, O God, plead your cause. Remember how the impious scoff at you all day long. Do not forget the clamor of your foes, the uproar of your adversaries that goes up continually." So again, so often these petitions in the Psalms of Lament are just calls for action. God, do something about this. Everything is wrong. You're the one who created all things. Everything's in your hand. So do something. Help us. Do the thing that we need to be relieved of this calamity. So those are some examples of Psalms of Lament, and there's many more in the Scriptures. I believe the Psalms of Lament are actually the most common version of Psalms, so they're very prevalent. And from Psalms like these, we could easily develop a theology of how to deal with those events that happen in our lives that seem to threaten our trust in God. In other words, we might ask the question, how do we respond in faith to the questions for which God seems unwilling to provide an answer in this life? And so we will move into that discussion next. So we've just looked at the Psalms, particularly the Psalms of Lament, and the ways in which Psalms of Lament illustrate especially vividly this need that we have as we experience this life, this need that we have in our faith to hold together God's twin attributes of mysteriousness and trustworthiness, and always rely on the two of those together. And as we look at these Psalms as a whole, it's possible for us to develop a theology of lament, or perhaps a theology of how do we respond to times of crisis in our life in such a way that our trust in God deepens rather than disintegrates. And from these Psalms, we might develop certain principles by which we understand the role of faith in the midst of hardship. First, faith has to be authentic to the experiences and feelings of our lives. It has to be honest and sincere about what really happens and how those events make us feel. We can't sugarcoat the world. It won't work. Faith has to be honest if it's going to be enduring. Sometimes people are sort of afraid to associate the emotions of sadness or fear or desperation with their faith, because we sometimes think that faith is supposed to be kind of a happy pill. You know, we're feeling down, go to church, feel good, go on with your day. But faith is so much more than just that. Faith equips us to live in this world as it actually is, not to just sort of put on blinders and act like the world isn't the way that it really is. These vulnerable emotions that we don't really want to experience are actually a part of realizing the reality of the world and the way that things really are. So, and lament is it's inevitable when faithful people seek to do the will of God in a God-denying world, right? We live in a world that oftentimes does not honor God, and so if we're going to seek to pursue the will of God within that world, then there's going to be these moments of deep friction, and it's going to be challenging. It's not something that God whisks us away from, and something that we can just sugarcoat away. There's a way of looking at the world that ignores the role of lament, despite its presence here in the Psalter. You can find a sugar-coated faith. Oftentimes, this faith is what's most popular. If you look at best-selling books on faith, they're usually about just adopting a positive attitude so that you can kind of get your mind off of things that are hard. This sort of non-lament view of the world sees hardships as things to overlook or look beyond or ignore. Just tell yourself everything will be okay, and then it will be. But the lament view of suffering in the world is to encounter it, to deal with it, to navigate it, to face it head on, to address it. And this approach, I believe, as evidenced in the Psalms, leads to true and authentic, real relationship with God, because we have to be able to practice our faith in the world as it really is. We can't isolate ourselves from the world for our faith time and then enter the world after that, and it's a separate world. It's not just about, okay, maybe we have an hour of private devotions in the morning where we isolate ourselves from the world, and then we go out into the world and try to ignore it as much as possible. We have to integrate our faith with the reality of our lives and the reality of the lives around us. The second thing we might draw from this as we think about a theology of lament is that humans have to accept our powerlessness. We have to accept our powerlessness to a certain extent, because so much of what we do is geared towards strengthening ourselves or asserting ourselves or being as powerful as we can be in the world. And sometimes we can start to feel pretty powerful. particularly privileged people like me are prone to this. That we have these great moments in our life where we feel like our lives are largely under our control. But when times get hard, of course, we're reminded that that is indeed not true. We're human beings, which means that we're going to live with a tremendous amount of powerlessness in our lives. But even while we have powerlessness, we can't just be resigned to it. We have to maintain a vision for what is right and how the world ought to be. God gives us a vision of God's will for a reason, because God wants us to work for it insofar as we're able within the world. So there's this tension between the power that God gives us and the responsibility that God gives us to pursue God's will, justice, freedom, and peace whenever we can, but also knowing that we're powerlessness compared to God, and that ultimately God is the one who needs to set things straight. I mean, that's why the Psalms of Lament are there. They're complaints. When the psalmist has run out of his own capacity, he tells God, you're the one that created the world. You're the one that is ultimately going to need to fix this. I've done what I can. And that's why we have prayer, right? We have prayer because we have so much powerlessness that we need God to act in order to see the world in the way that God would want it to be. So we have both a responsibility to act within our power, but also we are driven to prayer as we experience our powerlessness. And God has designed it to be that way, right? I often say the creature is not the creator. And the creature has been endowed with certain things by the creator, as our Constitution even asserts. But even still, ultimately, God is the one who is sovereign. God is the one who is powerful. And lament just begins by acknowledging this human powerlessness or this human dysfunction. We have to start there. We have to acknowledge that humans are broken people. We're broken people voicing broken things to God. But thankfully, in the process, broken things by God's grace often get straightened out. The third thing we see is that faith is often adversarial. And this is strange, I know, for some to think about. But faith is sometimes a struggle with God. It's right there in the scriptures. We see it in these Psalms. It's certainly a struggle with the enemies, right, that the psalmist evokes, whether those are human or spiritual or internal enemies. There's usually this triangle in the Psalms. There's sort of three parties involved. You have the psalmist, you have the enemy, and you have God. And the three of them are wrestling. The psalmist is trying to make sure that God is on the psalmist's side over and against the enemy, because the enemy is creating the sort of chaos that threatens to undo the order that God has instilled in creation. And so there's all this tension and struggle in these Psalms. You know, to engage with God in any way, even in an adversarial way, even if it feels like wrestling, to engage with God in any way is really to affirm our trust in God. Because even if we're wrestling with God and we're lamenting and we're saying, God, you need to do something, it's because we know that God can act, and we believe that God can act. And so even that engagement is, in a strange sort of way, a confession of trust in God's capacity to act as we know God to be from God's self-revelation and actions in the past. So laments ultimately provide the way to move affliction or hardship out of the realm of the merely accidental, out of the realm of random meaninglessness, into the comprehension of the way that we view the self and the world and our role in it and God's role in it. So lament rescues us from notions that the world is simply a bunch of accidents and is in fact still governed by a trustworthy God. So the good news of the Psalms of Lament is that they almost always give way to praise, as we have seen. And the affirmations of trust at the end of these Psalms demonstrate that to lament is ultimately to confess and to trust God. The miracle of the Lament Psalms is that the psalmists rarely get the answers that they seek, and yet they do come to a place of affirmation and trust. So they acknowledge that the power and wisdom of God is such that God can be trusted to handle our anger and pain and ultimately to make all things well. even when we don't get the answers that we seek, it's worthwhile to ask the question, asking the question, lamenting, complaining, wrestling with God's inscrutability is ultimately not an obstacle for trusting God, but rather a means of trusting God more deeply as we learn to rest more content in the midst of the tension that we feel as we seek to live this life faithful to God's will and in relationship to the faithful God. Thank you again for this time together. I'm going to go ahead and record another session, and I don't know if it will be added onto this or shown another time because I know it's getting a little bit long. So if this is it, thank you for taking the time to study the Psalms of Lament with me today, and I pray that your trust in God would deepen each and every day as you seek to live in the tension of the world as it truly is, but also in faith that God indeed is trustworthy. Come what may, God is in control. So thank you very much. Have a blessed day. Let us now go to worship and worship God together.